There's a moment early on where you're crawling through a cargo hold and you realize this isn't just an Indiana Jones game. This is the studio that made Wolfenstein, a series about mowing down Nazis with a minigun, deliberately taking the gun out of your hands. And somehow, that's the best decision they could have made. Because Indiana Jones and the Great Circle isn't a shooter wearing a leather jacket. It's something closer to a heist film crossed with an adventure movie, and it might be the most faithful video game adaptation of anything I've ever played.
So a little context on why this shouldn't have worked. The studio is Machine Games, based in Sweden, and up to this point, their entire identity was built on the modern Wolfenstein games. Fast, brutal, over-the-top first-person shooters where you're gunning down fascists by the dozen in alternate history settings. Then, Disney and Bethesda hand them the keys to Indiana Jones, a character who, outside of maybe punching a Nazi or two, solves most of his problems by running, thinking, and getting incredibly lucky. That's a massive swing for a studio built on trigger pulling. And the smart thing they did was not fight that contradiction. They leaned into it. This game came out December 9th, 2024 on Xbox and PC, day one on Game Pass, with the PS5 version following about 4 months later in the spring. And it plays less like their old work and more like Dishonored. You're sneaking, improvising, throwing books at people's heads to stun them, using whatever's in the environment, because Indy is not a super soldier. He's a professor who gets by on wit and desperation. That distinction sounds small, but it's the entire reason this game feels different from every other big-budget action game on the shelf.
Here's the part that got people talking before the game even properly started. The opening sequence is a frame-by-frame recreation of the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The temple, the golden idol, the boulder, all of it. Except you're playing it. It's not a cutscene you watch, it's the actual playable intro. And it's not there as a cheap nostalgia trick. It's a statement. Machine Games is telling you right out of the gate that they understood the assignment down to the smallest detail. The story picks up right after that first movie, which is a clever choice. It's not trying to slot awkwardly between existing films or contradict anything, it just fills a gap nobody knew was there. Indy ends up chasing a Nazi archaeologist named Emmerich Voss across the globe, teaming up with an Italian journalist named Gina, and the plot takes you through the Vatican, Egypt, Thailand, and a handful of other locations, each one built as this dense, explorable space, packed with side puzzles, hidden tombs, and what the game calls fieldwork, basically side content that's written and paced with the same care as the main story, instead of feeling like padding. And then there's Troy Baker as Indy. This is a guy who's voiced 100 characters at this point, but people who played this walked away saying it might be his best work yet. Not because he's doing a Harrison Ford impression, but because he finds the actual rhythm of the character, the banter, the exhaustion, the sarcasm under pressure. It earned him Best Acting in a Game at the New York Game Awards in January 2025, which is a pretty serious signal that this wasn't just good for a licensed game, it was just good.
Now let's get into why this might be one of the best looking games to come out in years, because the tech story here is honestly wild. Machine Games built this on iTech 7, the same engine that powered Doom Eternal. That's an engine designed from the ground up for fast, fluid first-person shooters running at buttery smooth frame rates. Nobody expected it to become the foundation for a slower, exploration-heavy adventure game about an archaeologist crawling through tombs. But that engine swap is actually a huge reason the game runs as cleanly as it does. iTech doesn't use the same main thread architecture most modern engines rely on, which is part of why players reported almost no traversal stuttering, a problem that's plagued nearly every big PC release the last few years. The headline feature, though, is that ray tracing isn't optional here. On PC, Ray Trace Global Illumination runs at all times. There's no toggle to turn it off, and the minimum GPU requirement reflects that. You need at least an RTX 20 series or equivalent AMD card just to launch the game. That's a bold move. This is one of the first big titles to make hardware ray tracing mandatory rather than a bonus setting. Then, on top of that baseline, PC players got a full path tracing mode on day one, what NVIDIA calls full ray tracing. That's light bounced and simulated the way film visual effects artists do it, accurately handling shadows, reflections, and indirect lighting all at once. Digital Foundry sat down with Machine Games developers specifically to break down how many light bounces they were tracing and how the geometry gets managed in real time, because it's genuinely doing more than almost anything else on the market at that point. The result is interior lighting that shifts naturally as you move through it, sunlight that behaves correctly bouncing through Vatican courtyards, and cutscenes that, on high-end hardware, start blurring the line between gameplay and pre-rendered film. For a studio that built its name on fast arcade-style shooters, pivoting to this level of lighting fidelity was as big a swing as the gameplay shift itself.
Now, I want to be honest, because a masterpiece doesn't mean flawless. Some reviewers pointed out that the AI can be inconsistent, and the pacing dips in the middle stretch once the game opens up into those bigger sandbox areas. But almost every single review lands on the same point. Even when a mechanical piece is a little rough, the whole experience is bigger than the sum of those parts. You forgive the occasional janky moment because everything around it, the dialogue, the way NPCs react to you, the way puzzles reward actual observation instead of hand-holding, is firing on a level almost no licensed game manages. And that's really the trick here. Most movie and franchise tie-in games exist to cash in on a name. This one exists because Machine Games genuinely wanted to build an Indiana Jones story that could stand next to the films. You spend real time flipping through Indy's actual notebook, called the Adventure Book, cross-referencing photographs and scribbled notes to figure out where to go next, which sounds like a small detail, but it puts you directly into the archaeologist thinking out loud fantasy the movies always promised and rarely let you actually do yourself. By the numbers, this thing landed around 86 to 87 on Metacritic, depending on platform, and OpenCritic put it in the 96th percentile of everything reviewed that year. It ended up the highest-rated Xbox console exclusive of 2024. That's not a fluke. That's a studio nailing tone, character, and pacing at the same time, which is genuinely rare for anything tied to an existing franchise. Then, awards season backed it up. It released too late in the year to make the Game Awards 2024 lineup, but Harrison Ford himself showed up on that stage to present an award alongside Todd Howard and Troy Baker, which tells you Bethesda knew exactly what they had. A couple months later, at the 2025 DICE Awards, the game walked away with 3 wins: Adventure Game of the Year, Outstanding Achievement in Story, and Outstanding Achievement in Character. It didn't take the top Game of the Year prize, that went to Astrobot, but 3 specific craft awards for story and character is exactly the kind of recognition a game like this should be chasing. It's since been longlisted for Best Game at the 2026 BAFTA Games Awards too, which shows it's still getting talked about well over a year later. So why does all of that add up to masterpiece and not just really solid licensed game? Because for decades, Indiana Jones games chased the wrong feeling. They gave you the whip, the fedora, the fist fights, but never the actual sensation of being an archaeologist who has to outthink a room before he can outfight it. The Great Circle finally nails that. It understands that the appeal of Indiana Jones was never that he's invincible. It's that he's clever, stubborn, and constantly one bad decision away from disaster, and somehow gets the job done anyway. Machine Games took a studio built entirely around gunplay and had the discipline to strip the gun away for most of the experience. That's not a safe move. That's a studio trusting the character enough to build the whole game around who he actually is, instead of what would look good in a trailer. And when you play it, that trust pays off in almost every scene. If you've played it, tell me what location hit hardest for you. The Vatican, Egypt, somewhere else? I want to know. And if you haven't played it yet, this is genuinely one of the few licensed games worth going in blind for. Drop a like if this made you want to boot it back up, and subscribe because there's a lot more of these breakdowns on the way.